Gigi was saying in the beginning that you're all sort of troopers and seasoned meditators, and I wanted to just try to get a little bit of a feel for that. Do most of you have what you would consider to be a regular practice where every day or as many times a week as you can, or maybe at retreat you have something that you do that's working for you that you kind of stay with? Raise your hands. How many would put yourselves in that group? So everybody. Okay, almost everybody. Now, I would also like to get a sense. Would you say, well, how many of you would say, let's put it that way, that you're pretty much satisfied with your practice? Maybe 90%. Maybe there could be a little frustration there, but for the most part, it's working for you, and it seems to be getting you where you want it to take you. How many would say that? 89% satisfied with your practice. Okay.
It's about half.
Okay.
Half the room is.
That's helpful for me to get a sense of that. And how many would say it's more like maybe 50-50, that it's bringing you some good and you're happy in that regard, but on the other hand, there's some frustration with it, or there's something that seems like, maybe it needs some tweaking or fine tuning, but you stay with it because you are benefiting from it. Okay, so, all right.
Yeah, most of them, I guess.
Okay, all right. I think that's enough information in that way. I won't ask if there's anybody that's absolutely totally fed up and can't stand it anymore.
That would be the honest answer.
All right. Let me see. I would say that there can be a number of reasons that one would practice. But almost universally, I think, one of the reasons, and probably in most cases the main reason for a practice, would be to access that reservoir of peace and silence and freedom at the deepest, most silent level within. And so I guess I would ask one more question. That would be characterized with different words and different traditions. It might be talked about as shunyata, that vastness, that unbounded empty space that's beyond and permeates everything. It might be seen as transcendental pure consciousness, or Atman, the infinite unbounded self that's beyond the limited transitory self. That would be from a different tradition. But one gauge of a technique would be, does it allow touching into that transcendence as a really available kind of experience? And I would ask you folks, how many feel that your practice is giving you that as a sort of a regular nourishment that it provides? How many would say that? Not very many. There's one.
We've got 3 hands up.
Okay, all right. Well, that's helpful to me. Now, at this point, I'll kind of switch gears a little bit. I would like to talk about practice a little later and offer you a resource that you could consider. But now I want to kind of switch gears and talk about how we wake up. I'm gonna make a huge conceptual leap here and assume that people that would participate in a group called Urban Awakening might have at least some tangential passing interest in waking up. I hope I'm not too off base with that. And you'll get used to my sense of humor as we go along. So the question is, how do people wake up? How do we wake up? And one way, which definitely happens, is it just happens. And there was nothing going on. There was no intention. There was no big something happening, but some moment just minding their own business. And the next moment they were living in a completely different reality. And it made no sense at all. It was completely unexpected. And from there on, they were awake, and they have no idea how that came to be. That's one way people wake up, and it happens that way. It's very mysterious. Another way people wake up, and this actually happens a lot, is out of some overwhelming circumstance. Something so overwhelming, it just completely takes them beyond themselves. It takes them completely out of their circumstances into a different reality, because it is so overwhelming. And I know a number of people who are awake, who woke up in that way with no kind of preparation, no intention, but the circumstances were so intense that it seemed that awakening was a response to that. Now, the thing about those two examples is there's nothing you can do about it. You know, those are sort of random occurrences. So it would be more useful to talk about what can happen by intention. And that brings us back to the question of transcending. As I said, one of the features or the purposes, you might say, of a practice would be to provide access to that reservoir of deep silence at the source of thought, beyond the mind, beyond the world, beyond the senses, beyond time and space. And to understand that, it's helpful to know that transcendental consciousness, to use the terminology that I came up with. I don't mean I invented it. I mean, I came through that particular tradition that uses those terms. But touching into that transcendental consciousness as an experience is complete silence, no thought, no sense of time and place, but 100% awake, actually more awake than under any other circumstances. And the significance of that is that it's a major state of consciousness. And here, when I say state of consciousness, it's important to distinguish. When I say major state of consciousness, I mean a permanent configuration of experience that has its own reality distinct from other major states of consciousness. And it's not the use of the word that you find often as something fleeting and transitory, as in psychology, we talk about states and traits. A state is something that passes through and changes, but a trait is something more established, something more permanent. I'm not using the word state in that way. I'm using it as referring to a permanent or long-standing, abiding reality. So the transcendent, when it's experienced, say in meditation, at those moments in the gap between thoughts, when there's that deep, deep stillness, that is actually a fourth major state of consciousness. In Sanskrit, it's called turiya. You find that word in the Upanishads. And turiya literally means the fourth. Now, to get a better understanding of this, it would help to look at other states of consciousness, major states of consciousness. And in total, counting the fourth, there are 7 in the framework that I'll be describing for you. The first of those major states of consciousness, the least awake, is deep, dreamless sleep. It has its own brainwave signature. You see delta activity, very, very slow, rhythmic waves, 0.5 to 3 or 4 cycles per second. And there's a unique experience to the first state of consciousness, and that is the senses are asleep. You are asleep to the world. There's no sensation, perhaps except for just a very, very abstract, vague sense of quiet repose, and maybe just a slight fragrance of the blissfulness of rest. And the mind is asleep. We are asleep to ourselves. That reality is completely different. That world is completely different from the world of the dream state, which is the second major state of consciousness. Dreaming is a completely different reality from deep sleep, and it's a completely different reality from every other of the 7 major states of consciousness. In dreams, the senses are asleep, the outer senses. We don't perceive our surroundings in any coherent way. We may dream about our surroundings, and there may be a sort of an odd, very almost, what would I say, phantasmagorical sense of our surroundings, but it won't be a real connection to them. But the mind is wide awake. The mind is running full speed ahead in a fantastic sort of way. It's spinning out worlds that are, they have just infinite variation and no seemingly logic about them. That's the world of dreams. And one thing about dreams is they are our own exclusive worlds. I might dream of a yellow Porsche, and probably lots of people do. But it would be quite a coincidence if you also dreamt of the yellow Porsche the same night that I did, and we would have no way of knowing anything about the reality of each other's dream unless we came to waking consciousness and had a conversation about it. And then we would be astonished if we found out that we actually dreamt the same dream. But in waking consciousness, the rules, the reality is again completely different. In waking consciousness, if I see a yellow Porsche and you're standing next to me, I can point and say, look, there's a yellow Porsche, just like the one I've been dreaming of. And you would say, oh, look at that, I see the yellow Porsche. So there's some logic, there's some consistency about that world, even though each person experiences it in their own unique way. In waking consciousness, the senses are awake. In dreaming consciousness, they were asleep. And in Sanskrit, the word for that state of consciousness is jagrat, which means world. In waking consciousness, you're awake to the world. In dreaming consciousness, you're asleep to the world, but you're awake to yourself, at least to some very, what would I say, powerful, but nonetheless dreamy aspects of yourself. And then that takes us to the fourth major state of consciousness, which I already talked about a little bit, which is just the transcendent, beyond thoughts, no thoughts. And we wouldn't say the mind is asleep, because that's a state of heightened awareness, but the mind is still. The mind becomes absolutely, completely still. And the senses also are completely quiet. Now, that fourth major state of consciousness, transcendental consciousness, that we would experience in meditation as a regular feature, eventually begins to cling first to the quietest levels of the mind, and then eventually to more and more active levels of the mind, until eventually, with experience, with time, with repetition, that component of our experience permanently abides. And at the same time we're engaged in dynamic activity, there's a powerful, infinite, eternal silence that is beyond all of the turmoil of the world. It's beyond the mind, it's beyond the senses, it's beyond time and space, and yet it's there simultaneously. That's the stage where one feels that one has gone beyond the relative world, and that now there's this dimension within myself that the world cannot touch, that is untainted by anything of the world. That's the fifth major state of consciousness. And my teacher referred to it as cosmic consciousness, which is not a very precise term. It might more descriptively be called witness consciousness, or in Sanskrit it could be called Sakshi Chaitana. Sakshi in Sanskrit is the word for witness. That is the stage in awakening where one sees that the world is transient, illusory, even unreal. One sees that I am not what I thought I was. I'm not my body. Reality is beyond those relative, changing, impermanent things. And one can have the sense then, because it's a big deal. We're talking about a dimension of reality that is infinite, eternal, and indestructible. When that is open to our moment-to-moment, all the time experience, and also, by the way, it abides all the way through dreaming and deep sleep. That's one of the hallmarks of the established, abiding fifth major state of consciousness, that witness element is still there in the midst of dreaming, it's still there in the midst of deep sleep. And there are interesting brainwave studies that show what that looks like. But when that is established, it's very important to know that the fifth major state of consciousness that I've just described is only halfway up the mountain. People teach from there. People have that awakening, And it's a big deal. You know, everything is completely different. Reality is completely different. And that reality is so big that people will assume that that's the ultimate reality. And they will teach from there. And they will teach a kind of detachment. They'll teach that the world is unreal. Even they'll teach that I don't exist really. You don't exist really. Because the contrast between that enormous vastness and the little transitory individuality is so huge that you may even be utterly dismissive of that individuality. As I said, that's only a way station. That's only halfway up the mountain. So what can come after that? You have a situation there where the inner reality is infinite and the outer reality is finite, illusory, transitory. Even the personality, the sense of the little me, the little ego, all of that is experienced as being separate, outer, not real, and material. Those are things. But to arrive at that fifth major state of consciousness, one had to traverse the full range of the mind, from the most active, turbulent surface levels of the mind, all the way down through quieter and more subtle levels of the mind, to the most silent dimensions of the mind, in order to reach that inner absolute silence. And because of that, there is developing quality of perception that is capable of experiencing finer and finer. And that quality of perception, having already accomplished that in the inward direction, begins to move toward finer and finer experience of the outer direction. And what happens then is the world that you see changes before your eyes. You begin by seeing a hard material world of separate objects. But as the perception becomes more and more subtle, and this happens by a kind of overwhelming force of gravity. It's just impossible for the awareness not to gravitate toward those finer and finer and more subtle levels of the out perception of the objects in the world, because the more and more subtle one is able to see and sense, the more beautiful, the more nourishing, the more perfect is what one beholds. And so much so that at the subtlest levels, even though it's the same world, it appears luminous. It can appear as if everything is made of light. Everything is radiant. Even everything is made of nectar. Everything is made of love. That is a sensory perception. That's the perception of the subtlest levels of the outer world. And that is the sixth major state of consciousness, which is called God consciousness. At that stage, the quality of devotion flourishes. It's impossible not to feel tremendous devotion to just the magnificence and the perfection and the sweetness of every particle of existence. But that is still experienced as something which is witnessed. There's still inner and outer. There's still yet a separation, because from within, one is a sort of absolute, or one has one's ground in that untouchable, vast emptiness. But the outer is yet material, even though it's the very subtlest, most sublime material. But there, something impossible happens. That gulf between infinite, absolute, and finite relative is so vast. Those are so different and incompatible realities that the only force that can cross that chasm is the open heart, which simply cannot accept any distance or distinction. So what happens then, as God consciousness ripens, is one begins to see whatever object one perceives as exactly the same as myself. One sees oneself in everything. And there's even a sort of a visual thing that happens, especially when this state of consciousness is just starting to open up. You look at another person and there's this odd sense, am I looking in a mirror? It feels like that. Because you just probably you're looking at yourself. And that expands, spreads out until it becomes all-encompassing. This is called unity consciousness. Until eventually nothing is left out. And it's no longer just the sense that the object that I'm engaging with, I experience as myself. But the entire universe, everything, past, present, future, near, far, conceivable, inconceivable, real, unreal, whatever, it's all. And that is sometimes called Brahman consciousness. Brahman means the totality, all-inclusive. And Brahman is not out there. Brahman is not a deity off in the clouds somewhere. The way to know Brahman is to be Brahman. Because Brahman is all-inclusive. If you're outside Brahman, then it ain't Brahman that you're outside of, because Brahman doesn't leave anything out. So the only way to know Brahman is to be inside. And the only way to be inside Brahman is to be Brahman. So that's kind of an overview, just a quick sketch of that particular framework of understanding what awakening is and how it unfolds, and the scope of what it can encompass. And I thought that would be a good little piece to offer you.
That's beautiful, Jay. That was a beautiful offering. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And let me say this, it's very real. it's important to understand that I'm not talking about something abnormal or exceptional. This human nervous system and this human brain evolved for nothing else but this unfoldment of experience. We know a lot about human development in psychology and embryology and so forth, but there are stages of development beyond just mere, growing through adolescence and becoming an adult. And those stages of development, they may take more than one lifetime, but they are inevitable. This reality, this awakening, this enlightenment is everyone's birthright. It's my birthright, and it is your birthright, and it is our children's birthright, and it is the birthright of every soul that was ever born and ever will be born. The question now, the sort of elephant in the room after I've said all of that, because I've pinned all of that, I've pinned that whole sweep of development on transcending. You habituate that connection, that contact. And so the next question, I tried to answer the question, how do we wake up? And the answer is, well, you transcend, and you continue to transcend until that transcendent becomes so familiar that it abides, and then it unfolds from there. So then the question comes, how do you transcend? And that's kind of a big question, because every tradition has its practices and its techniques.
Mm-hmm.
Some people find it just rather naturally and spontaneously within themselves, and without really any learned technique, they simply find within themselves how to gravitate to that silence. Those are people that I suspect were very devoted practitioners in the lifetimes previous, and they had already developed that connection. It's important to understand the nature of the mind is not a sort of random. The mind doesn't wander randomly. The mind wanders always in search of something more fulfilling. And so there can be nothing more fulfilling than that reservoir of eternal peace and unboundedness and freedom. So the mind will gravitate to it if it has some context or some opportunity to do it. And I think all of the practices of the different traditions are set up to create as well as possible a setting that will allow the practitioner to discover that natural tendency of the mind to gravitate inward, to gravitate toward that silence. Now, the techniques, scientists now categorize them in 3 different groups. Of course, there's some overlap and some variation, but the 3 are focused attention, which means that it's pretty obvious what it means. You're holding your attention on an object of focus, and there's some meditations that fall into that category. There are meditations that are called open monitoring, like Vipassana or mindfulness meditation, where you're not holding the focus, but rather you're maintaining a sort of an observational stance, and just allowing whatever passes through, and not judging that or trying to engage with it. Those are 2 kinds of meditation, and those 2 tend to have their own brainwave signatures, which would be gamma, very fast brainwaves that are associated with concentration. Quite simply, if you're working a math problem, you're going to have a lot of gamma brainwaves. And then theta brainwaves are more characteristic. Those are, what would that be, about 4 to 8 cycles per second, maybe 6 to 8 or more common in the meditation practices. Those are the brainwaves that are associated with drifting, typically drifting during the moments before you're falling asleep. But then there's a third category of meditation that's called automatic self-transcending or effortless self-transcending meditation. And the sort of gold standard of that category is transcendental meditation, which is the practice that I learned when I was still 18 years old, a while ago. But the research is very interesting because it shows that some advanced practitioners of the focused attention and open monitoring techniques show exactly the same brainwave signature, which is alpha brainwave activity that spreads through all the parts of the brain, all the way from the back to the front, and very high levels of coherence. The brainwaves are synchronous across all of those parts of the brain. That coherence is the hallmark of transcending, and that coherence, even in other brainwave frequencies, also is the signature of higher states of consciousness as well. So it seems that through those various systems of practice, some practitioners are able to access that sort of natural attraction of awareness to go to silence, to go to that finest level. But it also seems that many people find that they don't have enough time, or it's a more arduous practice, or somehow it doesn't seem to open that doorway for them. And the reason I mention this is just to offer kind of, for your database of information about practices, that transcendental meditation is often, I think, treated dismissively because it's effortless. Anyone can learn it. It's often presented in terms of not very spiritual benefits, relief from stress, sleeping better, lower your blood pressure, things like that. But it is a very, very profound and powerful spiritual practice for awakening.
How
And
do
so
you do transcendental meditation?
that's the practice that I learned when I was starting out, and I still do transcendental meditation every day, and I have done for 45 years. This might be a time if you want to show that 2-minute video.
Okay.
Which that would probably be enough just to show that. That's just a quick example of what transcending looks like.
Okay, here we go. This is what transcending looks like, guys. Y'all ready for this?
How do you visualize this?
Oh no, I don't know if you're ready for this. I don't know how to use this thing. So here we go.
Whoa, that's transcendence. Deception, transcendence.
All right.
What's going on? We'll be looking at her brainwaves when she's sitting, looking at you, and then also while she's closing her eyes and transcending. What's going on in the front of the brain is different than what's going on in the back. Also notice how active, how thick these signals are. This is very fast processing. This is what your brain does when 450 people are looking at you. So have Dariana close her eyes, and she'll begin the TM technique. And what you'll notice is one thing is this fast activity will begin to disappear, and you see very slow rhythmical activity. This very high amplitude rhythmical activity is alpha activity. And you'll also see it in all the different sensors. It was first seen here in the back of the brain. Notice as well, we see this rhythmical resting rhythm of the cortex here in the front of the brain. That whole mental chatter that's constantly going on, evaluating, deciding, planning, worrying. All of that is settling down. What we'll do now is just watch the brainwaves while Dharayana meditates. So the point I wanted you to see is how quickly the brain changes and how it's really fundamentally different than just waking experience. The experience changes the brain. You're adding an experience of silence, but it's not dull, it's not passive. There's a lot of vitality, there's wakefulness there, there's alertness. And that brain state and that inner experience is integrated in a very systematic, practical, real way with the ability to think and enjoy the world. The intriguing point is this happens naturally. It's nothing you have to try to do because experience changes the brain. And moving the brain back and forth from this restfully alert state during TM to focused processing and activity, the two begin to be knit together into one very integrated function of brain and consciousness.
The last thing I want to say here is you probably noticed when Dharayana started her TM. Now that was in real time. They didn't cut away and cut back. She started to transcend within about 1 second after he told her to start meditating.
Yeah, that was pretty incredible. It was immediate.
Yeah. Now the interesting thing about that is within maybe just a week or so of learning the practice, that tends to be the case. I won't take the time now to show them to you, but I gave Gigi some brainwave graphs that show this. The brainwave pattern during meditation, if someone has been meditating for just a month or 2 or 3 months, is virtually identical to the brainwave patterns in meditation if somebody has been practicing transcendental meditation for 8 or 10 or 20 years.
Wow.
The point being, it's automatic. It isn't a learned response. It's facilitating something that happens in the mind and happens in the brain that in some way is already there. It's just an inherent capacity that somehow we just need to find the door to get in. And the difference is that the brain waves of the 8-year or 10-year or 20-year meditator outside of meditation with eyes open begin to look very similar to the brain waves during meditation. And in the pictures that I gave Gigi, you can see that. It's quite striking. And the point being, as that transcendence begins to stabilize and become a part of all-time experience, 24 hours, all the time, you see it in the brainwaves. So the person is able to simultaneously be engaged and dynamic and creative, in fact, even more so. And at the same time, that unboundedness is always there in the awareness. And the brainwaves show that. It's interesting during sleep because people in the fifth major state of consciousness who've stabilized that transcendental dimension, during the deepest dreamless sleep, they have delta wave activity, those very, very slow waves, just like everybody else. And they simultaneously have alpha wave activity, which is the activity during transcendence in meditation that finds its way all the way to the most inert stages of sleep, and it never goes away. So that's all. That's everything. That's what I wanted to show you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. Thank you, Jerry. So as always, we open it up for questioning, but we open it up for questioning Jerry. And I always ask that the questions are really come deep from the heart, deep from the soul. And so that they're not just questions just for the sake of asking questions, but questions that are truly vital to you, so that it helps everyone else too when you ask it. So what? Yeah, David, can you just come up so that he can see you?
Sure. There's I'm
Just sit down.
a little too tall. There's a common experience. Hello, by the way.
Hi, David.
Where you can go through experiences of intense presence and awakening, and then go back into more of one of the, as you would call it in the 7 states model, the lower state of consciousness, and it kind of oscillates. And I've heard about this being common from many teachers. So do you have any guidelines that have helped you in maintaining that God consciousness? Or is that even worth put it like as a goal? Should you, I mean, how does that work? What's your experience of that?
Well, let me say a couple of things. First, I described a sequence of unfolding that sounds very sort of purposeful. You know, you do step 1, and then you do step 2, and then you do step 3. And it's like that for some people. But for a great many people, it's not quite as linear as that. You know, for example, that experience that I described where everything just looks luminous, and there's just an incredible sweetness about the whole visual field and every sense. Well, that's an experience. Yeah. That's an experience of God consciousness. But people have that experience. You know, it can come and go long before cosmic consciousness or witness consciousness is stabilized. So these things, it's very organic in most people's experience, how they actually come up. Another thing to say is that every experience of a deeper reality leaves a permanent imprint, and it's a promise. It may take time, it may even take lifetimes, but that reality, those realities, they're, what would I say? They will establish themselves. There's simply no way out. That's the direction that consciousness will flow, by hook or by crook. So any experience that you have of transcendence, or of that depth of perception that sees the really sweetest, most celestial value of the world, that's one more increment that you'll never step back from. Now, everyone does go through cycles of expansion and contraction. I talked about this in October when I was there with Francis Bennett. One thing to say about that, there's a fairly common experience of a way of experiencing transcendence where you go through a stage of egolessness. You know, some people will talk about ego death.
Right.
And I would ask, I asked before, but I'll ask again, how many have had an experience like that, where you just felt for some period of time, there's nobody here. I'm on autopilot 100%, and you know, nothing can touch me because there's nobody here. I'm beyond desire, I'm beyond attachment, like that. People experience that and they assume that when that experience never goes away, then I'll be enlightened. But the reality is that that experience of egolessness is one phase in a natural cycle that oscillates. So this is really important to understand. Experience moves. You know, awakening, ultimate awakening, whatever that means, enlightenment, is infinitely dynamic. It's not a static end state where nothing ever happens again. It's a huge, dynamic, powerful reality where everything happens with full power. And that's a misunderstanding that people have. They think, well, I'm going to get to that ultimate state, and everything will just stop. And that's not what happens. Everything really, really gets going because the entire universe is flowing in all of its dynamism within you. It's all consciousness moving within consciousness. The whole universe is moving within you. It's all consciousness flowing within consciousness in tidal waves. Well, the other thing that I was starting to say is it's important to flow. Life will naturally move through expansion and contraction, which means there are periods where it seems like we're wide awake and infinity is in the forefront of our experience. And then at other times it'll seem as though that infinity is perhaps lost or more in the background, and the more relative, perhaps even overwhelming, ordinary dimensions of life will be in the foreground. And this is a natural flow that happens back and forth from one to the other. So it's important to just allow life to naturally expand and contract. If you hold on to the expanded side of that experience, then that will create difficulty because it's the nature of it to naturally collapse, to allow the next stage of engagement with the details of life to happen. And then that itself will also collapse, we could say, and merge back into unboundedness. And that cycle will always continue. That's waves of consciousness just flowing, lapping against the shore, one wave after another. People try to hold on to the more unbounded side of that sequence, and they try to maybe hold off or suppress the more contracted side of that. But it's important to just to flow from one to the other, more flowing forward rather than trying to hold on to something that seems to have arisen. It'll be back. Whatever the unboundedness has been, it'll be back, and it'll be back again and again and bigger until it stays and never leaves again. And even then, there will be expansion and contraction within the unboundedness. It goes like that forever.
All right. Yeah. So I was going to say, Jerry, from my experience, the one who wanted a state to last and not oscillate stopped when the feeling of the seeker stopped. And I couldn't make that happen. There was nothing that I could do to make the seeker stop wanting to seek. And so again, that's just grace. It was like when grace decided that it was going to be in the perfect moment at the perfect time for me to do inquiry on the perfect bench by the ocean in that perfect moment. And somehow the seeker just kind of like the balloon of the seeker popped. The Gigi that was always constantly trying to have some type of state last forever, that motion inside of me just stopped. And there is no, like, I would say that when I hear of all these different levels of consciousness, what frustrates me a little bit is that person thought that it was going to look a certain way. That person
Really good point. Thank you,
I was
Gigi.
going to walk around and everything was going to be in light. And that every single time I saw someone, I was going to be like, oh, this is me. Oh, but it's like, it is like that, but it's also just not like that. It is like that. And it also just is just completely normal.
Everything is perfectly normal. Even more normal than before.
Even more normal than before, because I'm not trying to make anything happen anymore. I'm not trying to have a state anymore. I'm cranky today. I'm cranky. Yesterday I'm PMSing. Like I don't care. There's no, and it's funny and it's great, you know, and there's that frustration of trying to have things a certain way. Also, it's like you can't make, again, it's grace. Grace made it stop.
Is part of that
back?
Is part of that because of grasping? Because you're experiencing this powerful.
No, it's not because of grasping. It'll happen, grasping or no grasping. Grasping complicates it. Grasping causes difficulty. Now I'll backtrack and correct myself ever so slightly. I talked about that interlude of egolessness. You come out of that, and then there's again a sense of some sort of attachment. But that word attachment, it's important not to think of it in a sort of an absolute way. The little me, we'll say, does things by holding on to things. Something will seem important, there'll be some motivation, there will be something that really captures the attention of the little me, and it'll go for it. It'll be motivated, it'll work it, it'll be fixated on it. And that's natural. That's just the way a human life functions. But the thing about that is, when we have gained some, we might say, experience, some awareness, some degree of awakening and familiarity with how being awake as a human being works, we discover that little me, it actually has two jobs to do. One of the jobs is to take hold of things. Otherwise, we couldn't do anything. If we didn't feel at least the tiniest attachment, to this body, we wouldn't feed ourselves, So as a practical matter, there has to be. But the other side of it is that the little me also has the job of letting go. And before one is able to live in flow, before one is able to live in the context of a greater reality that's beyond the concerns of the little me, it holds on and won't let go, and it won't let go, and it won't let go. And that's what creates all of the trouble. That's where the grasping is. But that doesn't mean that the little me never takes hold of anything. That's its job. And that's what propels that cycle. There's something to do. The little me gets engaged with it, holds onto it, chews on it, works it until that particular thing has been dealt with. And then the job of the little me is to let it go. And sometimes when it does that letting go, there's an interlude that feels like egolessness. And we think, oh, I want this forever. No, it's not going to happen forever, because there's going to be a next thing that the little me has to engage with so that life can keep moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a little kind of grasping. But it's not the kind of grasping that holds on and refuses to ever let go. It takes hold of something, but then the next turn of the cycle, its job is to let go. It's done with that now. Let it go.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Appreciate it.
There's this business of non-attachment and never grasping and all of that. You have to be careful not to get too attached to that and not to grasp it too tightly, because it's not quite an absolute. You know, that grasping, it softens and it softens and it softens, and it takes a different character and a different flavor, and it actually serves a function that it couldn't serve when it was overly, tenacious before awakening could soften it and solve it like that.
But even the ego is part of the totality, in essence, right?
Yeah, see, in Sanskrit the word is ahankara, and if you look at it's probably Sankhya, Indian philosophy, that makes all of these outrageous lists of every possible thing in the entire universe. It talks about the 8 prakritis that build up all of the whole universe. Prakriti, the word means nature, and those 8 are, the subtlest is just the kernel of individuality, and that's called ahankara. And then the next from that is buddhi, which is intellect, and some scriptures will have them reversed, and it works either way. But in any case, then a little more manifest is mind, and then a little more manifest than that are the 5 senses. So 5 plus 3 makes 8, and the 5 senses go with the 5 elements, and there you have the whole universe has come out. And the seed of it was what? It was ahankara. It was the little ego. If you look at descriptions, Parashara wrote about all of the celestial bodies, and he described the sun, and that, at the basis of the sun is ahankara, at the basis of the moon is ahankara, at the basis of rain is ahankara. So it's baked in the cake. I mean, that little seed of individuality is the kernel around which everything in the universe crystallizes. Not one seed of ahankara, but multiple seeds.